Okay, so today's lecture is about fisheries, and first in the series is a little bit about what is a fishery and some of the various gear that we use in commercial fisheries. And then we'll have a couple of the videos that focus on the problems and the solutions of fisheries. All right, so definitionally, we're talking about all the fishing activities that are going on a single marine resource, specifically a living one. And here we have an example of a shrimp fishery, but that also implies that you can have any kind of seafood that is being caught. More than one or more stocks, we're really talking about the species and the location. So in this example, North Sea cod, location and species. And sometimes we include in the definition or the name of a fishery the type of gear used, a trawl fishery, or we could talk about a specific North Sea trawl cod fishery, something along those lines. The other thing to think about when we're talking about fisheries and fishing is that there are different levels of fishing. Subsistence is all about feeding a family, and that still is a very major part of how people get their food these days. Recreational fishing is more about having a good time. Some people go out and catch fish to eat. Others have more of a catch and release approach to recreational fishing. But this can actually have a very big impact on certain fisheries depending on where and how popular they are. Most of this lecture is going to focus on commercial fishing and the different types of gear that we use. Here are some images that relate to that, some very large fish catches, some of the gear. But we can also keep in mind that sometimes it's not a net, sometimes it's things like traps, and that it can be something as small as a single person. This is more of a subsistence kind of fishing with what's called cast net. Most of the time we're talking about fishing, we're going to talk about the gear as specifically the thing you are using to catch the fish. But in the next slide, we'll see there's some different types of gear we can refer to. So the first type of fishing we're going to talk about is using a purse seine net. It's a little bit redundant because seine means net in French. And this is the type of net that they use towards the end of Finding Nemo, where we had a school of fish. Most of the time they're one species, and they're swimming below the surface. And you have a fishing boat with either the ability to sort of put the net in a circle around the fish, or sometimes you'll see a small boat that goes away from the main boat and drags the net in a circle around the school. It traps the school. And at the bottom of the net where it's weighted, there's also a bit of a drawstring aspect to it, so that that can be pulled shut, and then the top can be pulled shut, and you basically have a net bag full of fish, and then all you have to do is pull that onto the deck of the boat. This is sort of a similar style of old-fashioned purse, which was basically just a drawstring bag. And again, that's really usually only one species, so it's pretty species-specific. But one of the problems that have been associated with this is that finding a school of fish below the surface of the water is a little difficult. So one older practice, although it's still being used, is to find species that tend to congregate at the surface that are associated with a school of fish. So, for example, a pod of dolphins is often associated with a school of tuna at the bottom. And the reason we have this issue of dolphin-safe tuna these days is that, most of the time dolphin can get out by themselves, but if they don't, they might get trapped, and then they're caught and harmed, and people like dolphins. So there's much more regulation now about pushing the net down and letting the dolphins out before closing off the bag. Dolphins aren't really an endangered species, but people do like them, so let's protect the dolphins. Hoorah. All right. Another type of net that you might encounter is a drift net or gill net. Again, you have a net that hangs down into the water. In this situation, it's just one straight line or sort of curvy with the currents, but it isn't made into a circle. It's got some weights at the bottom and some buoys at the top so that it stays nice and open. and is either attached to a buoy or some other type of device to keep it in one place, though it's not necessarily attached to the ship all the time. And fish are swimming along and they get caught in the holes of the net. They can't go backwards because their gill covers sort of act like a little bit of a barb and keep them caught there. Smaller fish are able to get through and are not caught in this, and so you're trapping larger fish that are desirable for market. Sometimes, though, you're talking about fish that get caught in there and are food for a larger species like a shark, and those other large species might try to eat them and get tangled in the net or make holes in the net. If this thing ever gets detached from its hold, you can have drift nets that sort of float through the water and are never caught, and they're sometimes referred to as ghost fishing. They continue to catch fish and kill stuff without ever having any benefit. So that can be a problem, especially with these drift nets. Some fish species are not going to be so easily caught by a net, but they'll go after bait. And so we have something called long line fishing, sort of the idea of having millions or thousands of baited hooks, but without all the people associated with a fishing rod. So you have a long line that's being held in the water with these buoys, and hanging down from that line are a bunch of hooks with bait on the bottom. And bait can be targeted at one species, so you can really be very focused on the organisms you're catching. However, you again have the problem of having your fish sort of hanging out there and are attractive to large predatory fish, so you have to make sure you don't leave them out too long or you're going to lose everything you wanted. And the other thing is that as this long line is being dropped into the water with the hooks, with the bait on them, a lot of seabirds are going to try and pick the bait off, things like albatross. And sometimes they catch their beaks on the hooks and get pulled underwater, and seabirds don't do so well underwater. They tend to drown if they're stuck there. So there are some people who are very concerned with this type of fishing for that very reason. Finally, we have trawl nets. They are the least specific in terms of what they're catching, because basically they're a bag-shaped net that's just dragged through the water. But it's kind of necessary for certain types of fish, especially ones that live along the bottom that aren't going up into the water column to be caught by any of these other methods. The problem is when you are dragging a trawl net along the bottom, and here we have the trawl net, sort of that ghostly shape in the background, and these are being used to keep it open. What you can't really see very well are that along the bottom of the net, to keep the bottom against the sea floor, is chain or other heavy objects, and that is dragging against the habitat. That can damage the habitat itself. These catch pretty indiscriminately, so anything that's in front of them does get caught up in the net. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those when it comes to problems and solutions. Last but not least, we have technology that's used in fishing that isn't the net itself. And people don't always think about this, but a GPS is a technology that is very, very commonly used these days because sailors want to be able to get back to the place that has the good fishing location. They want to be able to find their gear if they left it out. I'd mentioned in some of those pictures ahead the fact that traps are an important part of this. So you can have something like a lobster pod or a crab trap. Different types of fishing, the materials that make up the fishing line, they can help with durability so that you don't have to be replacing stuff so often. On the flip side, they don't break down if they're lost, and you can have that issue of ghost fishing that goes on for years. And another thing that they're starting to use is, for example, to avoid the trapping or harming of something like dolphins, is that scientists have noticed that fish like to aggregate or sort of congregate around a floating object. In this picture, we've got some algae floating caught on a log, but you can also have something like a buoy or another man-made object. And so fishermen will sometimes place that out into the water and go back and be able to find it and catch the fish that hang out around it. So fishing can involve a lot of different technologies, both the nets themselves and some augmentation technology as well.